Saugata sir, good afternoon. Can you hear me, sir?
Yes. Good afternoon.
Sir, namaskar.
Good afternoon. Namaskar.
Close the door. Saugata sir, good afternoon once again. Can you hear me?
Yes, of course. Good afternoon again. Yeah.
So this is our department classroom, our lecture hall. We usually organize all our such online sessions and offline sessions in the conference hall of the university. But this time that has been booked by another department for their conference program. So I thought I should switch it over to my classroom because all our classrooms even have such facilities. So I thought why not to use it. And let me introduce you to the department, the staff members and the faculty members in our department. Namaskar, sir. I am Dr. Nijarini Tripathi, Associate Professor. I'm heading the Department of English Languages and Literature. Along with me, we have few more faculty members. We have Professor Anjana Elu. We have Assistant Professor Prasanjit Sinha. We have Assistant Professor Nessa Sabor. We have another Assistant Professor Sanjit Kumar Das. He will join us very soon. We have our IT person here, Rashmi, and these are the students of both the semesters, second and fourth. Few of them will be joining online because there was no space in the room. So they are sitting in another room and they will join very soon, sir. My dear students, all the participants who have participated online, they have joined online. Let me introduce you to the speaker of the day. Is Professor Saugata Bhaduri. Who doesn't know him? The moment they got to know that you are giving an online session, sir, our students and all the participants are very much excited to join the session. So introducing Saugata Bhaduri. He is a professor at the Center of English Studies, Jawaharlal Nehru University. He has also served as visiting professor at many universities and colleges in UK, USA, and Europe, and has been the recipient of several international research grants and awards. His areas of research interest include literary and cultural theory, popular culture, translation, and comparative literature studies, and also the cultural history of colonial Bengal. This book is a great information and inspiration to me, sir, because I was thinking on the similar lines, whatever you have done for the cultural history of colonial Bengal, I'm thinking to plan something along with the help of my students and faculty members to come up with another book in the similar line, that is cultural history of colonial Odisha. I may need your help for the same, sir. His latest books are Polycoloniality, European Transactions with Bengal from the 13th to the 19th century, and it was published by Bloomsbury in the year 2020. Another book, the forthcoming, is A Critical History of Bengali Literature. It was published by Orient Black Swan. His earlier books include Transcultural Negotiations of Gender Studies in P. Longing. It was published by Springer in the year 2015. Literary Theory, an introductory reader. It was published by Anthem in the year 2010. Perspectives on Comparative Literature and Culture in the Age of Globalization. Again, it was published by Anthem in the year 2010. Negotiating Globalization, Anthem 2008, and Translating Power. It was published by Katha in the year 2008. I must say, sir, you have such a list of brilliant publications that itself inspires your audience, the students, the faculty members across the nation, and even in the international platform. And in fact, I am highly impressed with it. It gives me the idea that even we can venture into writing such books. Thank you so much. And I cannot actually express my words how glad and happy I was the day you accepted my invitation. And ladies and gentlemen, my dear participants, I would like to mention one particular thing. I don't regret giving this statement over here. Initially, I thought Professor Saugata Bhaduri is a professor from GNU. So he might be having some attitude, maintaining his own aura. But the way he easily accepted my invitation and he interacted with me in WhatsApp, then I realized he's such a humble person. And I very well remember my father used to say, the more a person rises up in his profession, in his career, the more humble he becomes. And I'm seeing the right person right in front of me. I really, from the bottom of my heart, thank you, sir, for sparing your time and giving this session to our students. Over to you, sir. Thank you.
Right. Thank you so much for your kind invitation and your very kind words. It's indeed a pleasure being here, albeit virtually, and sharing some thoughts with you and your students. We are supposed to talk about eco-criticism generally. Let me just begin. We all know what eco-criticism is. I mean, primarily when we look at literature and culture from the perspective of the environment and primarily look at environmental damages that may have been caused by us and try to be critical of the same, etc. We all generally know what eco-criticism is. But, and herein, of course, I would begin my talk, it is not enough to be eco-critical. That is a very important point, which is made even by probably the very book through which you get introduced to eco-criticism. So you must all be familiar with Cheryl Glotfelty's it's quite old now. It's almost how many? I mean, it must be 25 years old now, more than that, 27, 28 years old now. But Cheryl Glotfelty is the eco-criticism reader, which is probably the very book through which all of us get introduced to eco-criticism. That book itself, and Cheryl Glotfelty herself, in her introduction, and though the book is edited by Cheryl Glotfelty and Harold Fromm, you all know the book, I'm sure, the eco-criticism reader. The introduction is written by Cheryl Glotfelty alone. So Cheryl Glotfelty says herself in the introduction to this very volume that just like for most subcultures, for instance, I mean, just to digress a bit, you all know your general literary feminism following Ellen Showalter. Where Ellen Showalter says that there are three stages: feminine, feminist, and female, right? You know that. Similarly, to get back to what I was talking about, so as Cheryl Glotfelty says in her introduction, that just like in any subcultural form or in any critical discourse, we always have three phases. The first phase is where one is still in awe of what one actually wishes to criticize, but one is still kind of in awe of that. One almost imitates that, one almost adulates that, etc. In the second phase, one is oppositional and critical, right? But the third phase is where one really comes off one's own. You all know this tripartition. You all know the feminine, feminist, and female phase. I deliberately took that example because Cheryl Glotfelty herself also takes that example to elucidate the very point that she wants to make. So the point that she makes is that in any critical discourse, being critical, that is being contrapuntal, being opposed to something, having something right in front of you and being critical of it, and your only locus standi being that criticism, that is only the second phase. That is not the most mature phase. And therefore, Cheryl Gotfelty argues that if we are just eco-critical, that is ultimately we are critical of the general ecological damages that we are causing all around us. We are generally critical of, let's say, a particular dam being built there or a particular factory spewing smoke there. Then we are just eco-critical and nothing more than that. And that can only be the second phase and not really the most mature phase or the really developed phase. So, as Cheryl Gotfelty goes on to show that in eco-criticism also, we have a first phase where the nature poets, they were not really critical or contrapuntal. They were almost in awe of nature. From there, we move on to eco-criticism, which is the second phase, where indeed we are critical. And we are critical insofar as we are opposed to something, we are opposed to certain things, and vent our anger, as it were, voice our criticism, as it were. But as Cheryl Gotfelty says, one has to somehow move on to a third phase, where no more, exactly like when we move on from the feminist to the female phase, which I took up as an example, you must understand that no more are our positions determined by something else. Because both in the feminine and the feminist phase, as Ellen Showalter argues very vocally, the point of departure is still the man. The woman doesn't seem to have come of itself, of age. Rather, you have to either become like man or imitate man, or you have to oppose man, etc. Man is still the point of departure. Similarly, in eco-criticism also, in the general discourse of being conscious of the environment, reading literature and culture through the lens of the environment, if we are just critical, if we are just eco-critical, we would be doing only shallow criticism, where our major point of departure still happens to be precisely what we wish to critique, rather than environmental wisdom having emerged as a body in itself. It will always be only critical, always be only contrapuntal, always be only in response to something else, in response to the very thing that it chooses to critique, rather than being a discourse unto itself. And therefore, Cheryl Gotfelty argues, and this is like 27, 28 years back, that somehow we have to move on to a phase where our environmental consciousness is not just relational to, not just oppositional to something that has happened, not just shallow in that sense of the term, but rather something that is the very substratum of thought. So only when we have moved on to a third stage where we are no more really eco-critical, but almost eco-poetic, as it were. So this shift from eco-criticism to eco-poetics, so to say, where ecological wisdom, ecological consciousness is not merely aimed at criticism, not merely aimed at taking up something which we must oppose, and therefore we just lodge our criticism towards it, but where environmental consciousness becomes a very bedrock, becomes a very substratum of who we are, what we do, how we think. It becomes a very base. So that is where environmental wisdom comes of its own, as it were, rather than being only opposed to something or contrapuntal to something. And this very phase, therefore, this very reason, therefore, leads us to what we can call eco-poetics or eco-poetry, rather than only eco-criticism. But that being said, I have also by the by mentioned one more thing, and which I will come to in a minute, which is this idea of shallowness and deepness. Because already I have mentioned that eco-criticism or being eco-critical is being shallow. So it's only on the surface that you want to plug up this hole, you want to critique this particular thing, you want to handle this particular thing. That is just shallow. So I've already entailed that what I'm trying to talk about next, that is how one has to move on from eco-criticism to eco-poetics, as it were, is also a move from what is a shallow ecology to a deep ecology. But I'll come to that in a minute. I was still talking about how environmental wisdom, therefore, need not only be just a critical tool, just a contrapuntal tool, where the point of departure is still what I want to critique, and I can only just critique. But rather, environmental wisdom becomes the very basis of what we think, how we think. We think through the environment. We think about the environment rather than only being critical of certain things. Now, this whole idea where environmental wisdom becomes the very substance substratum, becomes the very bedrock, rather than merely a critical tool to be shallowly applied here and there, precisely leads us to the term ecosophy. You're, I'm sure, familiar with the term ecosophy. Actually, I can use the chat box also, so wherein I can just write these key terms that I'm mentioning one after the other, because that would help one. So I have already mentioned ecocriticism, and now I'm talking about another term, ecosophy, which is again a term that I'm sure all of you are familiar with. And by the by, I've also mentioned deep ecology, but that I'll come to, as I said, in a minute. So, what is ecosophy? So, ecosophy, as you know, as the term itself suggests, is environmental wisdom, right? Ecosophy, right? And so that kind, where ecological sensibility becomes philosophical in itself, it becomes not merely critical, but actually the very substratum of our knowledge systems, of what we know, right? And the move that I said, so if we at all have to understand the role of environmental literary and cultural studies, we have to move from ecocriticism, mere ecocriticism, to ecosophy, as it were. Now, this term ecosophy, as you probably are aware of, was coined by Guattari. I mean, the same Deleuze and Guattari duo. You're all familiar with Deleuze and Guattari. So more often than not, we always see Deleuze and Guattari together as a pair, because the books, most of the books that we read by the two of them are written by the two of them. But when it comes to ecosophy, Guattari, Felix Guattari himself, he coined the term, and he is the one who's generally credited with having built up the whole idea of ecosophy, as it were, which is this whole philosophical substratum where environmental wisdom becomes a very substratum. Now, Guattari has a very interesting book, a very, what should we say, a slim book, as it were, Three Ecologies. I don't know if you've heard of this. So Guattari's Three Ecologies. I'll just type it down. So that you can, it's easy to type, but just to kind of so that you have it in front of you. But I'm sure you are aware of this book. So Felix Guattari is a very influential book. It's a very slim book. Calling it a book is probably giving it too much. I mean, it's a short treatise, The Three Ecologies, which was actually in 1989. So that also is quite old. But Guattari, in this particular book, almost to lay out before us what ecosophy should be all about. What is this fundamental idea of being I mean, having knowledge, having such knowledge where ecology and environment becomes the substratum of knowledge itself? He talks about how there are actually three ecosystems. We use the word ecosystem also quite loosely, so our own social ecosystem, etc., etc. So he talks about how there are three ecosystems, and these different systems, how they interact with each other, or how they run parallel with each other. This is something that one will again talk about in a little more time. But in Three Ecologies, that is why it's called Three Ecologies, he says that there is an ecosystem of the self, because we individuals, we ourselves also have some kind of an ecology, some kind of a system to which we belong. Then there is society itself, the social ecology, the social ecosystem. And then there is environment. So it is, I mean, the only way we can ecosophically think through our existence is when we can see how there are three intrinsically connected systems, three ecologies that always interfere with each other, intersect with each other. And ecosophy, being ecosophical rather than merely ecocritical, entails us being able to understand these entanglements, how the self is entangled with society, how the society is entangled with the environment, and how all of these are entangled together. We cannot talk about human history without also talking about environmental history. We cannot talk about environmental history without also talking about social history. We cannot talk about social history without, you get the general deal. So ecosophy, in the Guattarian sense, in the Deleuze-Guattarian sense, let's bring both Deleuze and Guattari together here perhaps. So in the Deleuze-Guattarian sense, ecosophy, or being able to do environmental wisdom such that we are not merely shallowly critical of this or that, but actually make environmental wisdom the very substratum of our being, of our thinking. That way, that ecosophy, the first step towards ecosophy is to understand the deep entanglements, the deep connections amongst the self, society, and environment. How the three ecologies continuously intersect and entangle with each other. And this whole idea of entanglement, because this is also a key word that I've just presented before you, this will become very important as we proceed further in our discussion and we move into understanding entanglement itself. But currently, we are just talking about ecosophy and trying to understand ecosophy. Now, Deleuze and Guattari, since one has mentioned Deleuze and Guattari already, Deleuze and Guattari have, I'm sure you are generally aware of Deleuze and Guattari, but they, amongst many other books that they wrote, as you know, they wrote 2 volumes called Capitalism and Schizophrenia, 2 volumes of Capitalism and Schizophrenia. The first one is called Anti-Oedipus, which I'm sure all of you are familiar with. And the second is called Thousand Plateaus. So you're familiar with both the volumes of Capitalism and Schizophrenia. Now, Deleuze and Guattari, so not only does Guattari coin this phrase ecosophy and try to almost lay before us what ecosophy is all about, but Deleuze and Guattari actually practice ecosophy. They try to, because ultimately capitalism and schizophrenia, as you know, is about, in a way, about political philosophy and psychological philosophy. Capitalism and schizophrenia, one would think that capitalism concerns socio-political institutions. Schizophrenia, of course, entails psychology, how the mind works. And yet, as you would realize, in the second volume of Capitalism and Schizophrenia, Deleuze and Guattari call their volume 1,000 Plateaus. So the very vocabulary through which, so they want, I was talking about the entanglements, ecosophical entanglements between the self, society, and environment. And you see how to be able to talk about the self in terms of psychoanalysis, in terms of schizoanalysis, in terms of schizophrenia, and to talk about society in terms of capitalism, in terms of political developments. To be able to talk about these two, you cannot but invoke the environment. Because, and that is why the title of the volume is 1,000 Plateaus. Because why bring in this metaphor? Why bring in this particular vocabulary? And since you're all aware, I'm sure, of 1,000 Plateaus, that is the second volume of Capitalism and Schizophrenia, you would know how not just plateaus, not just, I will be talking about space in a minute, but just for illustration, not just plateaus. Another very important metaphor that Deleuze and Guattari use in their book, the second volume of Capitalism and Schizophrenia, that is 1,000 Plateaus, is arboreal metaphor. That is metaphors of plants. You're all aware of rhizome, right? So as in the very introduction to 1,000 Plateaus, Deleuze and Guattari go on to show that we have treated books and therefore selves also, therefore societies also, as roots for a long time. I'm not going into rhizomes generally because that would make us digress into a very long discourse. But you are aware how Deleuze and Guattari argue that we have talked about roots for very long, right? So roots are, of course, arboreal. Arboreal is the adjective for tree. Arbre is the French word for tree. So the arboreal metaphor of the root is something that we most often use. Roots move vertically down, right? And roots always branch in binary manner, the one becoming two. And roots kind of give you firm mooring into the ground. But Deleuze and Guattari go on to show in the very introduction, in the very first chapter of their book, 1,000 Plateaus, that one has to rather talk about rhizomes. One has to rather talk about, rhizomes, which are underground branches that run parallel to the ground, that branch here and there like ginger, as opposed to carrot, let's say, rather than one central presence that moves vertically, rectilinearly down and branches into twos. Rhizomes move hither, thither, anywhere, here and there, all the way. But anyway, that was more of an illustration to come back to what I was talking about. So see how Deleuze and Guattari, when in 1,000 Plateaus, they want to talk about capitalism and schizophrenia. But the metaphors that they're using are either biological or geological. The metaphors that they're using are either of plants and also of animals. I'll come to animals also in a minute. I mean, the Deleuze-Guattarian use of animals. So the metaphors that they're using are either of plants and animals like roots and rhizomes, or I'll come to animals in a minute, as I said, let's just hold on to it, or geological, that is plateaus and space and plains and mountains and valleys. The point is that Deleuze and Guattari almost initiate and illustrate also this whole field of ecosophy, where they are doing philosophy. They are doing political philosophy. They are doing psychological philosophy. It's a philosophical work, but a philosophical work that takes environmental wisdom and environmental vocabulary, both biological and geological, as its primary corpus. So, where environmental wisdom and environmental elements become the very substratum, as we were discussing earlier, of being able to produce other thought. So, are Deleuze and Guattari eco-critical? Probably not, because it's not that in their book they pick up a particular environmental hazard and criticize it, but they're ecosophical, because their entire discourse, where they're criticizing capitalism, they're criticizing Freudianism, but their criticism is rooted through following the three ecologies pattern of ecosophy that Guattari had already pointed out. They root their entire philosophical discourse through environmental wisdom, thereby almost performing this deep task that we were talking about. No more is it shallow eco-critical, but it's a deep ecosophical task. Now, this whole deep ecology, since I've already mentioned deep ecology several times, this is a term, as you know, was coined by someone called Arne Ness. And actually, I can just write. I initially thought of using the chat box, but then so Arne Ness. I can just write down his name. Again, I'm sure you're all familiar with Arne Ness. Arne Ness coined the term deep ecology. So the point is similar. The point that I've already made, that there is actually one can even mention the whole article. So Arne Ness writes this article, again a very old article, 1973, more than 50 years old, called The Shallow and the Deep, Long Range Ecology Movement. That is the full title of Arne Ness's very influential article, where he builds up this case for deep ecology. The point is what I've already stated, but I'm now elaborating through Arne Ness, through the idea of Arne Ness, this idea of deep ecology. So the idea is that there can be a shallow ecology. As Arne Ness clearly points out, shallow ecology, as I said, is where we just skim the surface. We just look at the surface and we look at some issue here, some issue there, and we criticize this issue, we protest against that issue. But that will not really solve the environmental degradation that our whole world is being driven towards. Because rather, to be able to solve it actually, we have to perform a deep ecology, where rather than just skimming the surface, rather than just moving on the surface, we actually go into the depths. We try to look for the depths, as it were, almost a kind of depths that in a way was already suggested by this whole ecosophical foundation, as it were. So deep ecology tells us that we cannot merely dwell in the surface. That kind of ecocriticism, Cheryl Gladfeld had already told us, is just the second phase. We have to rather look deep. This digging deep into the structure, as it were, digging deep into environmental issues, rather than only skipping the surface, this itself, this whole model of digging deep, this itself has been talked about by many thinkers, and soon I'll just build up on this digging deep business with my next keyword, or impacting deep, the whole idea of depth itself, with my next keyword, which is the Anthropocene, but that I will come to in a minute before I cover certain other things. So we were talking about Deleuze and Guattari, and we were talking about A Thousand Plateaus. Now, in A Thousand Plateaus, of course, there are so many chapters, but one particular chapter, and this is very, very important, and this is chapter 3 of A Thousand Plateaus. Now, chapter 3 of Deleuze and Guattari's A Thousand Plateaus is called 10,000, it has got a longish title, 10,000 BC, the Geology of Morals. Who does the earth think it is? That is the whole title of the chapter 3 of Deleuze and Guattari's A Thousand Plateaus. 10,000 BC, a geology of morals. Who does the earth think it is? Now, in this particular chapter, of course, it completely talks geologically about the kind of impact that human beings have caused to Earth, etc., and how the Earth almost replies back. So, a very ecosophical take on what we have caused, the deep damage that we may have caused to Earth. But at a more surface level, the particular point of departure for Deleuze and Guattari in this particular chapter is a story by Arthur Conan Doyle. You all know Arthur Conan Doyle, and you all know Arthur Conan Doyle for Sherlock Holmes. Just like many authors of detective fiction, they also have a science fictional character. Like, for instance, those amongst you who may be familiar with, let's say, Satyajit Ray's works. So Satyajit Ray has this detective character Feluda, and he also has this scientist character, Professor Shonku. So similarly, Arthur Conan Doyle also, I mean, we know Arthur Conan Doyle more for Sherlock Holmes, but Arthur Conan Doyle also, just like he parallelly wrote Sherlock Holmes stories, he also parallelly wrote another series of stories which are science fictional in nature and which has this mad professor as his protagonist, who's called Professor Challenger. Now, and this is Arthur Conan Doyle is more famous for Sherlock Holmes, but an equally major character that he created and an equally important body of works that he wrote was science fictional, with Professor Challenger being his protagonist. And there is one particular story by Arthur Conan Doyle involving Professor Challenger, which is called When the World Screamed. That's the name of the story. Again, I can just write it down. When the world, just so that you can remember, When the World Screamed. This is year wise I can search right now, maybe 1928. Let me just when one is talking, why not give you the whole year. I think it's 1928, but let me just check it so that you know when it was written. When the World Screamed, yeah, it is 19 yeah, just a minute. So which year? I'm just trying to find out the year. 1928. I was right. So 1928. But anyway, so in this story, what happens? Very interesting. So Professor Challenger is in any case this mad professor who keeps on doing all kinds of experiments. And in this particular story, Professor Challenger is inspired or egged on by another explorer kind of a guy called Peerless Jones to dig deep into the earth. So this is, in this particular story, this is the experiment that they are conducting. That how deep can you dig into the earth? How deep can you drill a hole? And Professor Challenger is of the firm conviction that our planet, this world, is a sentient being. It's a living being. He's firmly convinced of that. But nevertheless, following Peerless Jones's suggestion, he starts digging. So both Peerless Jones and Professor Challenger, and they have another sidekick, John Malone. He's the general sidekick of Professor Challenger in all stories. Like many of these characters always have a sidekick, like Sherlock Holmes had his Watson, etc. So Malone, Challenger, and Peerless Jones, they start digging into the earth, digging deep. We were talking about this deep metaphor, the depth metaphor. So they start digging deep into the earth. And soon what happens, I mean, once they've crossed the crust of the earth starts emitting sounds as if it's getting pain. This is in the story, in the science fictional story. So earth, I mean, suddenly the earth starts moaning, groaning, then crying in pain, then howling, then crying really out loud. So the earth, so world starts screaming. The point is that can the earth be thought of as in a deep model? Rather than only at the surface, once we try to stretch our environmental wisdom into its depths, can we think of this whole earth as a living being, as a sentient being? And in this particular Professor Challenger story, When the World Screamed, as Professor Challenger keeps digging, so finally earth throws up noxious fumes, and Professor Challenger and all, they fall unconscious because it's like, so the earth revolves, the earth almost replies back, the earth almost answers back. But anyway, this is the Professor Challenger's story. Now, what Deleuze and Guattari do is, in their chapter 3 of A Thousand Plateaus, which is, as I said, 10,000 BC, a geology of morals, what does the earth think it is? So that is the whole time. Who does the earth think it is? That's the whole title of the chapter. So in this, they take off on this particular story by Arthur Conan Doyle, and of course, primarily focus on this depth idea. The On the one hand, of this whole sentient earth idea. So it's not just the surface that we merely scratch, the biosphere that we just kind of, and the immediate, let's say, troposphere that we probably just scratch, but somehow there is a depth model, a digging deep onto the earth, almost causing geological changes onto the earth, so much so that the earth revolves, the earth replies back, the earth sings back, cries back, etc., etc. And they also talk about these strata, the different stratum through which Professor Challenger's digging goes on. But what is even more interesting, and herein I'm tempted, it wouldn't take much time because we have a lot of time in any case. It would be great if I could share share my screen of the first page. I'll first have to locate the first page, that is, and it will be very, very important in doing that because in this particular chapter, they do a very interesting thing, which is, let me just try to locate the chapter first, and to do which it wouldn't be difficult at all. If I can locate the chapter, I'll be able to show you what I want to show actually. Right. That's very good. So let me just share my screen.
If you want to share your screen, it's possible, sir. We can do that. Please
Yeah,
share.
I'm sure I can. I'm just thinking of sharing the screen just to show you the first page of this chapter, because there
Yes,
is a
sir.
very interesting thing that happens there.
Of course, sir.
And that is very important. So I'm just trying to share the screen. Right. So, yeah. Just tell me if my screen is shared.
Yes, it is, sir. We can see that.
Yeah. So this is the first page. So the chapter goes on. I mean, so this is, I just located the chapter itself. So this is, I was talking about chapter 3 of Deleuze and Guattari's A Thousand Plateaus. So it's called 10,000 BC, the geology of morals. Who does the earth think it is? And then it goes on, and it's a longish chapter, but it's a fantastic read. As I said, about Professor Challenger and how Professor Challenger himself, maybe if one can hide, it doesn't matter. But that is not what I was talking about. So currently, that I've already talked about, how Professor Challenger made the earth scream, and how Professor Challenger digs into the earth. And I'll come back to deep ecology, through deep ecology, into the idea of the Anthropocene in a minute. But what I wanted to draw your attention to is this lobster, this figure of the lobster. So Deleuze and Guattari begin their chapter, wherein they almost ecosophically, in any case, the whole work, A Thousand Plateaus, is ecosophical, but where this particular ecosophical take on deep ecology, as it were, because one talks about this depth of digging, it not only talks about the particular Professor Challenger's story, but it begins with this picture of the lobster. Now, this is very important. This is not what I'm talking about currently. I will in a few more minutes. But what is a lobster? So obviously the lobster is another species. So the whole idea, in fact, Deleuze and Guattari go on to say God is a lobster. And there is a reason behind that, but that we wouldn't go much into. I just got tempted to show you the picture of the lobster. Now, this is very, very important. So the lobster is, of course, a companionate species of ours, and I'll come to this whole idea of companionate species, the whole idea of how species connect, how ecosophy, I mean, to move on with our keywords, soon I will talk about the whole idea of species meeting, about companionate species. But the lobster, again, one is not just reminded, it's very, very important. So not only is the lobster another species, it of course is, and therefore in a deep ecosophical understanding of our environment, we have to necessarily continuously refer to the other species that also inhabit this world with us. Not only that, the lobster, being a Cretaceous crustacean animal, it far predates us, and we human beings have just come into existence just a few million years ago. But the crustaceans, they have always been there before us. So these are our, let's say, the crustaceans, or the Cretaceans rather, and the arthropods, the mollusks, they obviously have lived on this earth for far longer than us, and therefore the earth belongs to them more. But not only that, also in popular discourse, lobsters always, because of their pincers, these pincers, the two top pincers with which they can hold, they can grab things, lobsters almost always exhibit a model of companionness. For instance, and of course, this Deleuze and Guattari may not have been aware of, but in Friends, the TV series Friends, you may remember that in a particular episode, Phoebe talks about Ross and Rachel as being lobsters. Has anyone watched this episode? So you are my lobster, and lobsters kind of almost. Yeah, right. So Pratik Pattanayak has raised a hand. Yes, please go ahead. This can be a very interactive session. Please tell me what you have in mind.
Pratik, if you want to ask any question, you can ask him now, sir. Otherwise, can we keep the questions to the end? Whatever is
Yes, yes. And since someone raised one's hand, I thought that probably he or she had
over to you. Pratik, can you hear me?
Maybe it's by mistake, because otherwise he would have already raised the question. That's all right. So I was talking about Phoebe. So you are generally aware of Friends, the TV series Friends, and in one particular episode, Phoebe talks about Ross and Rachel as being each other's lobsters, and almost like lobsters holding their pincers together and walking. So that scientifically may or may not be true, and Priyanka knows the reference that I'm talking about. But so lobsters with their pincers also suggest this companionness, this hold, as popular belief runs, this holding together. But there is one important thing, and that maybe we can come to later because it's not very significant at this point of time. However, lobsters are rigid, because the shell that the lobster has, it's not supple. It's not that it can move in any angle. It's a rigid hold. It's a hold, certainly, a kind of a grasp, so to say, a clasp, but a very rigid one, because your exoskeleton, the exoskeleton of the lobster, is made of rigid substance. This you just keep in mind, because soon we'll move on from more rigid possibilities of connections to more supple, fluid connections that the entanglements that we were talking about, the rhizomatic connections. Yes, no, there is no significance of that whatsoever, because Deleuze and Guattari thought that they could just, in a fanciful way, put up the picture of one lobster. In any case, I am building up. As I said, this is an aside. I had no real plan to.
That's a question from Sanskriti. Sanskriti, did you get your answer? You can unmute
Yes,
yourself, Sanskriti.
I'm sure Sanskriti has got her answer, and that's a wonderful point to point out. But I thought that this visual cue of the lobster would be good, in the sense that not only will you get a sense of how there is because often we are very scared of philosophers and theorists, and we think that they probably talk all kinds of obtuse stuff. But generally, and Deleuze and Guattari particularly, but many others, they're very, let's say, funny also, because reading theory is great fun. And so I also wanted to share with you even the title of this chapter, but now one is digressing a lot. The whole phrase, the geology of morals, I mean, that is a pun on Nietzsche's genealogy of morals. Again, you must be familiar with Nietzsche's book, The Genealogy of Morals. So it's playful, it's fun to say God is a lobster, or to present the picture of a lobster, and then take on Professor Challenger, again a very popular cultural text, to talk about these strata of the earth, and through which a deep drilling is what Professor Challenger does, and what we also do, and to invoke this whole ecosophical sensibility through certain references that may seem profane, that may seem mundane, that may seem quotidian. That is the point here, and I just wanted to share this the screen to show you this figure of the lobster, not necessarily with any other purpose. So yes, I mean, unfortunately here there is only one lobster, and I got digressed too much into lobsterity, as it were, into lobsterness, including the companionship metaphor from Friends, which, as I said, as a serial which is much after Deleuze and Guattari would not have been aware of Friends, the serial Friends. But whatever. To come back to what I was talking about, and therefore I may stop my presentation, because this screen I just opened just like that to give you this figure of the lobster. And we'll come back to the last point that I mentioned, where companionship, but a companionship that is rigid, because the lobster mode of companionship, yes, right. Sure, this lobster does look in a way, but only he has his hands raised up rather than spread wide, almost like someone who is at an airport security check kiosk, perhaps getting frisked. But yes, it's wonderful. And that is exactly how one should proceed, where images spark thoughts in you. And it's so wonderful. And that is the idea of this connections, the entanglements, the rhizomatic slippages, the slippery connections amongst unrelated things, which in a way does sum up the whole ecosophical, the thrust of ecosophy, so to say. But to get back to what I was talking about, so I incidentally talked about, God is a lobster, certainly, and they made a very valid point about that. But since that is not exactly what we are discussing today, let us just move on to. I was talking about I primarily I've already introduced almost my next keyword, the idea of the anthropocene, from deep ecology. So just to repeat what one has said so far, so one began by taking ecocriticism as our keyword, which is the apparent title, the topic of our discussion today, and which is the more common term. But then, following Cheryl Glotfelty, one went on to suggest that while ecocriticism is okay, but unless and until we move on to ecopoetics or even ecosophy, that is where environmental wisdom becomes a very substratum of us being environmentally sensitive. We will merely be critical. We'll merely be doing shallow ecology. The objective is to do deep ecology, because ultimately what concerns the earth is a deep damage that we may have done, and not just a shallow case of doing a little deforestation here, or breaking down or filling up a pond there, or damming a river there. It's not that shallow. It's a deep impact that we have caused. And this deep ecology therefore calls for us being ecosophical in nature, where through entanglements we think of this deep point, yes, from merely oppositional, that is the point that Cheryl Glotfelty also makes, from being merely oppositional to actually having this depth model, which Ornes provides for a term with, namely deep ecology. And Guattari had already provided a better term, that is ecosophy, where we are environmental wisdom is the thing, rather than merely being oppositional and critical. But this whole depth model, that is that we have damaged or we have impacted the earth such that it's not just on the surface, but we have deeply impacted the earth. This leads us to our very next keyword, which I've already presented before you, that is the idea of the Anthropocene. What does the idea of the Anthropocene entail? Now, as you know, whenever we have this suffix "scene," it means a geological era, right? So, generally speaking, geologists, hardcore geologists, those who, like, even in your own university, if you have a geology department and if you go to a geology professor who actually studies rocks and minerals and ask him, are we in the Anthropocene? He may give you a bit of a smirk, because hardcore scientists, hardcore geologists probably still don't admit this new geological era called the Anthropocene. But there have been some suggestions, and the suggestions began quite some time back by Sturmer, by Crutzen, and even before that, as we are told, there may have been stray instances where some geologists, so this is not your let's say your regular geologists, the ones who, the normative geologists as it were, but some geologists had already proposed, at least as back as the 70s, as indeed Paul Crutzen and Eugene Sturmer had, or even before, that we human beings may have impacted the world such that we have ushered in a whole new geological era. So the change, what is a geological era? When does a geological era get formed? When do we move from one scene, see any scene, to another scene? When do we move on Pleistocene, Holocene? When do we move on from one scene to the other? When the Earth's geology stands altered. It's not a question of just the surface standing altered in minimal ways, but in a depth mode, the whole geology being impacted. So, of course, the classical geologists would go on to say that we are still very much in the Holocene. The geological era that we are is very much in the Holocene. And within the Holocene, does anyone know which age we are in? According to geology, according to standard geology, which age are we currently in? Does anyone know? We're in the Meghalaya age. That is the particular age within the Holocene. So within a scene, then there are ages. So a particular stalactite, a stalagmite, I'm not much into geology. So in Meghalaya, discovered somewhere in Meghalaya, it indicated the beginnings of a particular geology. So anyway, I mean that was just a quiz question, so to say. So according to standard geologists, we are currently we continue to be in the Meghalaya age of the Holocene. But some geologists went on to say, no, 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 no. We have actually moved on to a new geological era, which is called the Anthropocene. And Anthropocene, as the name itself suggests, is where a whole new geological era has been ushered in because of the anthropos. Because of man, man has done such deep ecological damage, such deep changes to the earth, not just on the surface, that the geology of the earth has stood change. It's not just the surface topography has changed, the geological composition of the earth has changed, apparently. And therefore, we may have moved on to a whole new era. That is the Anthropocene. And of course, as I said, many geologists would disagree. They would say, no, 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 it's nothing like that. I mean, but when does the Anthropocene begin? Or from when can we say the Anthropocene really began? There, people differ. And there is a lot of disagreement. So some may go on to suggest that from the very time that we started agriculture, but what, in short, what are the things that the anthropos did unto the earth, because of which we probably have done such deep impact that we moved on to a new geological era. That is the point of the Anthropocene. So when did it begin? So some may say right from the time human beings started agriculture. And that would practically push Anthropocene as way back as the Holocene itself. Because Holocene began with the last ice age. And in a way, agriculture also roughly began around that time. But the point is that those, right, Priyanka, but that is according to some people. So I'm discussing them one after the other. So according to some, so when did Anthropocene begin? So wherein opinions vary. Some would say Anthropocene would have begun with agriculture itself. Right? And so that would push it back. So the whole of the Holocene might have actually been Anthropocene too. Because the moment human beings started doing agriculture, they started tilling the land, they started using water resources, forming channels. So in short, they altered the very, let's say, composition of the earth in a way by artificially fertilizing land. So it could have begun as early as the beginnings of agriculture. But then some others, like Priyanka, in her comment just now pointed out, some others will go on to say, no, 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 no. Maybe it began with industrialization. So maybe only around the 15th, 16th century, when there was this rapid industrialization that started. So not plantations, but with the emergence of capital, perhaps. So when one really started exploiting the earth's resources and really started polluting the earth's atmosphere with all kinds of fumes, etc. So that's when we really started altering the earth such that a new geological era may have ushered in. So the new geological era could have begun 10,000 years back, or it may have begun just about 600 years back or so. So people may disagree. Some others may say, no, 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 not even that old. Maybe the time from when we started using fossil fuels. So coal was already used, but petrol. So when the whole drilling unto the earth to take up what was originally of the earth. So the moment we start kind of exploiting the geological strata and for producing through fossil fuels further effluents or further things that we emit into the atmosphere. So these dates may disagree. People may disagree. The proponents of Anthropocene may disagree totally as to from when the Anthropocene would have begun. And some may even go on to say that no, maybe with the nuclear age. Because till such time, so from when one started agriculture, from when one started fossil fuel extraction, from when one started industrialization, we would still kind of not be altering any element, because the element that we would excavate will continue to be the element. Because even if we suppose I take out iron, and with iron I fuse whatever manganese and become steel, but still the elements are the same. But when the nuclear age starts, human beings start actually in a way editing elements, in a way altering the elements. Because what is the whole idea of enriched plutonium? What is the whole idea of isotopes? So uranium. So the idea is that human beings, still now, human beings did not suitably alter the geology of the earth, because they had indeed started extracting, they had indeed started digging deep, but none of the original elements stood altered by the human beings. But with the coming of the nuclear age, human beings started editing elements, because the enriched uranium will not be anymore the natural uranium. So the moment, so that is another argument. So the question is, and we'll not be able to resolve, because for the simple reason there is no agreement about Anthropocene, the existence of Anthropocene. So how can there be agreement about when Anthropocene would have begun from? So whether it began with the starting of agriculture, or it began with the starting of extraction of fossil fuels, or it started with the extraction with the beginning of industrialization, or it started with human beings investing in nuclear energy and therefore altering elements of the earth. But there is some agreement, more so probably amongst social scientists and cultural studies people than amongst geologists and scientists, that human beings may have really impacted the earth deep. So much so that the geological composition of the world has to change. So much so that we may have got ushered in to a whole new geological era, not just a surface era, but a whole geological era, that is the Anthropocene. And there is so much writing about the Anthropocene. You're probably familiar with the most popular ones amongst them, like Dipesh Chakraborty, for instance. Dipesh Chakraborty, I mean, you are all familiar with. Dipesh Chakraborty has a whole book, also, The Human Condition in the Anthropocene, which is worth reading, and which is fairly new, just 7-8 years old. And much before that, as in somewhat before that, let's say at least maybe 15 years back, Dipesh Chakraborty originally proposed this. Dipesh Chakraborty has a wonderful article, which is again something that all of you can read. I'll just kind of it's called the Climate History 4 Thesis. So it is again, I'm just providing some basic bibliography also, so that, but I'll come back to my keywords. So Dipesh Chakraborty, the Climate of History 4 Thesis. Yes. So Dipesh Chakraborty is a Climate of History 4 Theses. So which is something that you can pick up. A little while back, when we were through Guattari talking about ecosophy, we were talking about these entanglements, the entanglements between human history and natural history, right? Now, as the Dipesh Chakraborty points out, that more often than not, the way we categorize our knowledge systems, we always separate natural history from human history. So human history is more the subject of exploration by the social sciences and the humanities, where through economics, political science, sociology, literary studies, culture studies, history also, we study human history. That is such, this civilization came after that civilization, this culture came, this social change, we moved on from feudalism to capitalism, etc. And on the other hand, there are some other people who do natural history. That is the geologists, the paleontologists, the biologists who study natural. So natural history and human history have always kind of been compartmentalized. But as Dipesh Chakraborty argued way back in this particular famous article of his, The Climate of History 4 Theses, and this was 2009 actually, so like 15 years back, he already argued that these are not two separate projects. Just like Guattari had argued much back, much before the whole Anthropocene, the Anthropocenic movement, the Guattari had already argued that the self, the ecology of the self and the ecology of society and the ecology of environment, they are entangled with each other. Similarly, the proponents of the Anthropocene would also go on to show that we cannot talk about anthropic history without talking about geological history. We cannot talk about human history without talking about natural history, the history of the environment. The history of human race is inextricably connected to the history of the planet, the history of the world, and we have to take them both as the same project, as it were, and it is all kind of entangled together. Now, so far, so good. There is no problem herein. So, Anthropocene seems to be a suggestion where human beings apparently have done such damages unto the world that geologically the earth stands changed in a deep manner. And this consciousness will indeed help us become ecosophical rather than being merely ecocritical. So far, so good. But wherein someone called Donna Haraway, and you are, I'm sure, familiar with Donna Haraway's, general Donna Haraway's works, and we will refer to many Donna Haraway works today. But Donna Haraway has this fantastic article. Again, I will just type the name of the article here. You're familiar with Donna Haraway. She gives us a series of terms. So I'm just talking as I'm kind of sourcing the title of the article and doing it. So she gives us a series of terms. So along with Anthropocene, so Anthropocene is the term that we have got used to. But Donna Haraway in this article, which I've just kind of put in the text box, so it's a particular article of hers, and this is an article that is that dates from 2016. She goes on to give a series of terms: Anthropocene, Capitalocene, Plantationocene, and Chthulucene. We'll come to Chthulucene a little later. But Donna Haraway's argument is that so far so good, right? So you have kind of said that the human beings have caused such change to the earth that it has deeply geologically impacted the world, and we've been ushered in to a whole new geological era. Let's call it the Anthropocene. But Donna Haraway goes on to say, why call it Anthropocene? Because if we call it Anthropocene, there are two things that we are doing. So, okay, so a lot of damage, general geological alteration has been done to the earth. But if we continue to call it Anthropocene, then we are actually giving credit to the very agent for this destabilization. So, to name the age after the very reason, after the very culprit, so this is almost having semblances of anthropocentrism. So even when we are admitting that we human beings have been very bad, we have been naughty, we have really damaged the earth deeply and geologically, still we are so self-centered, we still want to call even that damage by our own name, Anthropocene. So the term Anthropocene does not suitably get rid of the anthropocentrism in it by naming itself still Anthropocene. So Donna Haraway says, so why call it Anthropocene? Because you're not doing much there. You're just holding on to this. So look how powerful I am. I can even alter the earth. I can bring about a geological change, etc., etc. But furthermore, Donna Haraway also goes on to say that anthropos entails the whole of humankind. So if you call this era Anthropocene, you are basically suggesting that the whole of humankind, all human beings all over the world, all anthropos are equally to be blamed for this geological damage. But that's not true. Because evidently, differentially in different parts of the world, human beings have done different degrees of damage. So in some parts of the world, we already, as I said, have moved on to nuclear energy and caused severe damage, mushroom clouds and all that, radiation. In some parts of the world, probably human beings are still living at a hunting-gathering stage. They have not even moved on to agriculture. So if you call it Anthropocene, then rather than really naming the actual reason that has caused the geological change, you are unnecessarily either being anthropocentric by calling human beings to still have the agency, or you are involving and invoking and implicating all human beings when only a small section of human beings of the developed world. Yes, Sarveshwar Pradhan, do you have a question? Okay, again, maybe the hand may have been raised by a mistake. That's fine. But please, yes,
Sir,
Sarveshwar. Yes.
Your
Yeah.
voice is your voice is and your presentation is, sir, outstanding. Was is very much outstanding. So that I am raise my hands.
Okay, but
He just wanted to
maybe,
convey you the message
yeah,
that your presentation
yeah.
is
Yeah, you can raise your hand
outstanding.
to raise a question, perhaps, if you do have a pressing question. But compliments can wait, maybe, because that does not necessarily contribute to our discussion. But anyway, to go back to what I was talking about, so Donna Haraway goes on to say that then why call it Anthropocene? Why not? If capital had caused the damage, let's call it Capitalocene. So, okay, maybe a lot of I mean, change has been done to the world, and geologically the world has stood altered. If that has been because of industrialization, as someone earlier pointed out, and because of capital, if the world, let's call it Capitalocene. If it has been because of plantations, let's call it Plantationocene. Let's call it exactly by the name, rather than blaming the whole of humankind by calling it Anthropocene, or rather than sticking to some kind of a vestige of anthropocentrism by calling it Anthropocene. Let's call it Plantationocene, let's call it Capitalocene, etc., etc. So that is another series of keywords that we can write hereafter, after the last keyword. So actually, since I'm also giving you these bibliographical things, so maybe the series of keywords has in a way got a bit muddled, but I will, towards the end of my talk, again I will build it up. So along with Anthropocene, one has introduced now two more keywords, Capitalocene and Plantationocene. But so far so good. But there is another word here which probably is drawing more attention, because Plantationocene and Capitalocene are understandable, and that is the idea of the Thulucene. Now, what is Thulucene? Now, that is very, very important, and for which one has to step back again, probably in our discussion, to the lobster. As I said, I'll come back, and as you can see, the title, the very title of the Donna Haraway article is Anthropocene, Capitalocene, Plantationocene, Thulucene, Making Kin. So this whole idea of kinship that I was talking about, this connection, this connections among species, through the lobster metaphor, one was talking about this entanglements, this connectivities. So this making kin, being able to almost form bonds of relationship with our non-human co-partners in this whole world. But anyway, let's not jump the gun, but let me just take a slight flashback here. So to the lobster image that I was talking about. So the whole idea of making kin entails we being able to hold each other's hands, we being able to kind of get entangled together, get connected together. But as I also went on to say earlier, so let's say we human beings are not alone. We, in our own anthropocentric way, presume that we own the world. But clearly, we don't own the world. Not only is there a geological world, which we probably have done tremendous damage to, but there is a biological world, our co-species who inhabit the world along with us. So non-human animals, plants. Earlier one already talked about the rhizomatic image of where arboreal metaphors get invoked, or Deleuze and Guattari invoke also animal metaphors. So animals and plants and other species that are all around us, they are very much our partners. They are our kin. And the idea is to be able to make kinship with them. Now, earlier, and this is where I am taking this brief flashback, so to say, I was talking about the rigidity of the lobster's pincers. And I was talking instead about how a more rhizomatic, slippery entanglement, when you're connected, but not rectilinearly, connected, but not rigidly, connected but only tenuously, connected in a very slippery, in a supple fashion. That connection cannot probably entail in the lobster metaphor, because lobsters ultimately have rigid exoskeletons. But then there are beings that we can conceive of which have tentacles, which have slippery appendages. But let us keep that aside for the time being, because when we come to Thulucene, come to understanding the Thulucene in a minute, we will definitely talk about what Thulu entails. What is the idea of Thulu? What is the idea of this chthonic connection? And wherein we'll move deeply into tentacular connections, into tentacles. But currently, we have just stopped into animal studies, as it were. So the fact that from Anthropocene we moved on to Plantationocene, Capitalocene, and therefore the whole idea was that rather than being anthropocentric, we have to, if at all we want to redeem this world of ours, if at all we want to, in a deep ecological, in ecosophical way, try to talk about the environment, we also need to talk about making kin with other species. And this making kin with other species leads us straight away to animal studies. And animal studies is indeed has emerged as a very major field of late, and fairly important people have invested themselves into animal studies. So Deleuze and Guattari, of course, I mean, Deleuze and Guattari we've already talked about. In fact, one of the chapters of A Thousand Plateaus, is it chapter 10 or so? Let me just again, since we should leave nothing to this kind of tentativeness. So it's called Becoming Animal. That's the title of a chapter of Deleuze and of A Thousand Plateaus. But I'm just trying to find out the exact title. Also, I think it's chapter 10. But why speculate? I'll just, in a minute, I'll just type, and I'll get the chapter very easily. Right. So Becoming Animal is chapter. What chapter is it? Just a minute, because I'm trying to find out the chapter number. Ultimately, the title is well known. That is Becoming right. So in following a similar pattern, which is basically I'm trying to track pages of A Thousand Plateaus and kind of sharing them with you. So this is, again, I mean, the sharing is not very significant, but just for to give you a visual aid, as it were. Right. So I'm just sharing Becoming. So the chapter is called Becoming, is chapter 10. That is, so becoming intense, becoming animal, becoming imperceptible. So that's another chapter of A Thousand Plateaus, chapter 10. So Becoming Animal. I was just referring to the term becoming animal. I was just saying that how animal studies is not something that only, I mean, let's say only some derivative scholars have nowadays started doing, etc. Even very fundamental philosophers have deeply engaged in animal studies. But two other books. So this is a chapter. So in Thousand Plateaus, there is a whole chapter, chapter 10, which is Becoming Animal, right? But more importantly, there are whole books where almost the key thinkers of our own times have engaged with animality, with the idea of animality. That is how we are very much connected to animals. This kind of kinship that we were talking about, where animals and we have to become part of the same continuum. So, for instance, Agamben. I mean, you are familiar with Agamben himself. Agamben has this whole book. Again, as we are talking, I'm tracing the title of the book and pasting it, typing it in the thing. So Agamben has this book, The Open, Man and Animal. Again, a book that all of you must read. It's again a fairly slim and fairly, though dense book, but nevertheless. So Agamben goes on to suggest that ultimately man and animal are very much connected to each other. But there is a certain openness which alone can kind of make us admit this kind of relationship that we have with our non-human planet mates, with our co-species with whom we are in a kinship relationship. But this openness is what we close. We become human. How do we become humans? What is this whole idea of being human, becoming human? We become human by precisely foreclosing this open continuum, this open connection, trans-species connection that we otherwise have. Because if we are open to this trans-species connection, we will never be able to carve out a separate space for ourselves. I, me, myself, I, human being. This whole anthropocentric discourse will never find any place. So this open is what stands for closed. That is Agamben's longish theory, but in a very slim book otherwise, which you must look up. The point that I'm making is that in animal studies, we have very key theoreticians of our times, like Deleuze and Guattari, like Agamben, and also like Derrida. So you must be familiar with Derrida's This Animal That Therefore I Am. Yes, of course, exactly, Mehul. So, right, that was exactly the next text that I was moving towards, because I'm also naming texts, as you know. So, Derrida's The Animal That Therefore I Am, and Mehul, thank you for pointing that out. So, The Animal That Therefore I Am, and you're familiar with the title, I'm sure, The Animal That Therefore I Am doesn't need any typing, but nevertheless, I mean, so Derrida, right? So, Derrida's book, The Animal That Therefore I Am. Right. So, yes. So, again, a very, very interesting book. So, where Derrida, we are just being anecdotal a bit, because, and I should also keep a close watch on time. We have enough time. In this book, Derrida, many of you must be familiar with this book. So Derrida starts talking about how once he and his cat were both in the nude. Now, cats are usually always in the nude. I mean, unless you, in a very perverse manner, make cats wear dresses. But why Derrida was moving around in the nude, that Derrida alone would know. But anyway, I mean, inside his home, he can do whatever he wants to. But the idea is that this is how it begins. So both Derrida and the cat, they stare at each other and almost kind of looking at each other in their elementarity, in their nudity. And Derrida comes to think of this just like I think something about the cat in its elementarity. The cat also must be thinking something about me. The cat also must have some image about me. Anyway, that's more anecdotal. It's slightly more complicated than that. But Derrida goes on to therefore establish this discourse that ultimately it's not that I and the cat are very separate. We are actually part of the same continuum. We are part of the same mechanism of constructing each other, of gazing at each other. And I am therefore also an animal. This animal that therefore I am. But whatever it is, so let's say some of the who's who of contemporary theory have indeed dabbled in animal studies, have indeed theorized on precisely this continuum that the human being and the animal share with each other, this kinship that we must have with each other, this becoming animal, not really at kinship, Priyanka, but some kind of a forming opinions about each other, and therefore it's a metaphorical kinship. So it's more like being connected. Being connected is the more important thing. Kinship is a metonymic term that one just borrowed from Donna Haraway. One need not literally always think of kinship as kinship, but the fact that the human being can think of oneself as an animal, that itself is in a way a metaphorical ascription unto oneself of some kind of a kinship with animality. So that is very, very important. But we kind of went into animal studies primarily through this idea of the Thulucene, and this whole idea of making kin. Now, what is Thulu? So that is very important. Now, Donna Haraway goes on to say that she did not borrow this term from, and you probably all know of Lovecraft, the science fictional writer Lovecraft. So Lovecraft has this, H.P. Lovecraft has this character called Thulu. Again, I'm a bit bad with spelling Thulu, so I'm trying my level best. Why doesn't not let me first write Thulu, but then I'm sure I have misspelled it. So I'll just Google Lovecraft's spelling. So Lovecraft has this character, H.P. Lovecraft, the science fiction writer. So I'll just don't go by the spelling that I've written, because that is clearly not the right spelling. There are some more H's here and there. Yeah, Cthulhu. So Thulu. So Lovecraft, the idea of Thulu. Cthu. I'll just share a few. So Thulu. So H.P. Lovecraft has this. So now I'm just sharing this screen with some images. Basically, I'll just right. So this is just some. A simple googling will lead. If you Google Lovecraft Thulu, you will get led to these images. Oh, sorry. What did I? Where am I? No, sorry. Am I? just a minute. I think I'm just a minute. I think I'm just right. I'm sorry. I wanted to project some images of Thulu, but instead probably I ended up. Okay, let me click on some image of Thulu, and then maybe I'll be able to, because I instead moved on to a reading list. Lovecraft. Yeah, this is probably good. Let's see what I end up projecting, because I'm yes, yes, this is good. So these are some images. This is exactly the page that I wanted to share screen. I just googled Lovecraft and Thulu. So HP Lovecraft has this character Thulu. So just see how Thulu looks. Okay, so Thulu, like almost like an octopus. Maybe let me present a bigger image of Thulu alone. So is this? Yes, that's much better. So the same image that I was showing earlier, but through the Google search, now I've just clicked on one image. So that is HP Lovecraft for you. And that's, of course, what Thulu looks like. Thulu is a character, and almost a speculative character, a speculative animal character who has this octopus kind of head with tentacles and etc. So Thulu is a character from H.P. Lovecraft's universe, H.P. Lovecraft's fictional universe. But what Donna Haraway says, I mean, she strongly disputes. She strongly says that no, but I have not borrowed this term from Lovecraft, because see how my spelling and Lovecraft's spelling are different. Because Lovecraft, yes, Sanskriti, in a way, yes, problem. These are all very Thulic characters. So no, Shorodip is not just an octopus; it's Thulu. I mean, you should not mix up any octopus with Thulu. Thulu is quite a formidable character. But the point is that anyway. So Donna Haraway goes on to say that look how my spelling of Thulu, because her spelling of Thulu, as you'd remember, if you just scroll up as I'm doing in the text box, her Thulu is Chthulu, whereas Lovecraft's Thulu is Chulhu. So the placements of the H's are a bit different. And Donna Haraway goes on to say that though her idea of Thulu is very close to the kind of idea that Lovecraft had given, but practically she borrows it from the Greek word thon, and which stands for earth. So like tonic, we say autochthonic, as you'd know. So Chthon, I'll just write it. Thon. So the Greek word for earth is thon, and she says that Thulu refers to more the thon, the Greek word thon, and not to Lovecraft's character Thulu. She also credits a particular spider called Pimoa Thulu. So which is again, I'm sure my spelling of Thulu will be wrong, but it doesn't really matter. So Pimoa Thulu is a species of spider, and she says that probably is the spider that I have in mind. But anyway, at the end of the day, because let's not fool around by just trying to think of what Donna Haraway would have had in her mind when she used the term Thulu. But at the end of the day, she has in her mind these creatures, probably speculative creatures, fabulous creatures, creatures that are in a way, but all creatures who have tentacles, all creatures who have a curious, like octopus. Octopus was the figure that came to someone's mind here. So which all have these tentacles, these curious appendages with which they can connect together with each other. So we were talking about animal studies, but it's not any animal studies. So it's not studying animality per se. It's not studying animals like a zoologist, that you just study animals. On the contrary, the whole idea of invoking animals is with the idea of talking about almost displacing the Anthropocene with the idea of the Thulucene, where this world is not just the Anthropos' world. It instead belongs to the chthonic. It belongs to all these tentacled characters who are in kinship with each other, who are in bonding with each other. And tentacular bondings which are not rigid like the lobster's pincers, but bondings which are slippery, bondings which are tenuous, bondings which are tendrilous. So tendrils and tentacles, these become the models really. And Donna Haraway, therefore, I mean, to still dwell with the idea of ecosophy, and with which one is still dwelling, I will, while talking, just move a bit because there is this sun coming. I mean, don't worry about me moving. So I'll just try to move somewhere where. Or maybe it's getting more sunny, but don't bother much. Yes, of course. So staying with the trouble, that's the name of the making kin in Thulucene. That is the whole idea. But I was talking about making kin and the whole idea of the tonic, and thereafter I just got reminded. I think one has to draw the curtain because the sun is getting too oppressive. But yeah, does it help? Not much, but anyway, probably a little better. And since I've got up, I'll also plug in my charger. Don't. So these are the luxuries of an online classroom. One can parallelly do certain things. Maybe other people do it more discreetly by shutting off the camera, but it really doesn't matter. Since I got up, I might as well as do it. Just draw the curtains a bit more. I haven't been able to probably darken the room suitably, but it's okay. I think, anyway, it doesn't matter. I changed my seat also, as you must have noticed from the shift in the background. But the sun, maybe the sun is also aware of the fact that today we are talking about the environment, and it is just showing itself, because Delhi is not known for its sunshine in this part of the year. But to get back to what I was talking about, so as has been rightly pointed out just now by Priyanka, so she has a whole book, Staying with the Trouble, Making Kin in Thulucene. And the idea is to displace Anthropocene, not just with Plantationocene or Capitalocene, but with a positive notion, because ultimately it makes no sense to just kind of cry over the fact that we have indeed damaged the earth. The question is, what next? What do we do hereafter? How do we recover the world? That is of far greater concern. And wherein she thinks that making kin, and making kin how, and making kin with whom, making kin Thulu wise, that is making kin, and this is in a way connected to the idea of planetarity in a slightly different way, and which is something that one would not necessarily talk about today, but again, it's a very key term that you do know, the idea of the planet, how we have to think of the world as a lived planet, and planetarity and planetary connections. Dipesh Chakraborty has also written about planetarity in a big way. One can introduce that also as a keyword. Why not? Because we're just typing random words. So planetarity is also something that you are fairly familiar with, I'm sure. So the idea of the planetary, but we're talking about so an alternate notion of the world. One is still holding on to the geological suffix, right? Scene. So one is still thinking of the world as a geologically modified world, but a speculative future geological era where, rather than the anthropos having ruled the world, or even the anthropos being descended, but we talking about Capitalocene and Plantationocene, we can instead think of a scene, a geological era where Thulu-wise, that is throughout the earth, in the planet, through tentacular connections, we have been able to almost form this bond among species. We are able to forge kinship ties across species, and maybe that geological era can be something that can redeem us, or a speculative future that we can look towards. Now, whether that is realistic or not, that is another thing, but that will come to in a minute. So the current keyword that we have got stuck with, the current key phrase, as it were, is tentacular thinking. So this is the key term that we have currently got stuck with, which is tentacular thinking. That is what Donna Haraway, the term that Donna Haraway introduces. And in the same book that just now Priyanka drew your attention to, one of the chapters, chapter 2, actually, in staying with the trouble, making kin in the Thulucene, one chapter is called, and this is the title of the chapter. I'm just kind of doing it. So the last time I pasted, that was directly with Anthropocene, Capitalocene, Chthulucene, but this is chapter 2 of Staying Out of Trouble. Tentacular tentacular thinking, Anthropocene, Capitalocene, Chthulucene. And this is, I mean, bibliographically moving. This is chapter 2 of making a kin in the Chthulucene. So I'll just type that also. Right. So I'm not very sure if it has got pasted, but probably it has. Yeah, chapter 2. Yeah, so tentacular thinking, Anthropocene, Capitalocene, Chthulucene. That's the name of the chapter. It's chapter 2 in Staying with the Trouble, Making Kin in the Chthulucene. That's the name of the book, Staying with the, which Priyanka has already pasted before. But what is tentacular thinking? What is this whole idea of tentacles and this bonding with? In fact, Donna Haraway has another very important book called When Species Meet. Almost like Jab We Met, but with a slight interspecies twist to it. So this is another book. These are all books by Donna Haraway, and I invite you all to read these books by Donna Haraway, because in fact we will soon go into Donna Haraway a bit deeper. Soon, as in a little more time, more towards the end of my talk perhaps. But this is another book by Donna Haraway, When Species Meet, and this is very, very important. So the idea of the species meeting through tentacular bonds, almost forging connections and almost becoming indiscernible through tentacles. So, and the thought, the ecosophical thought itself kind of flowing in a free flow through tentacles, as it were, tentacular thinking rather than rigid connections. So it's not like forging connections, it's forging very slippery, tenuous, tendrilous, tentacular connections, thinking not in a straightforward manner, but in a tentacular manner. And this kind of forming hybridities, this is extremely important in a way. But what is important is, and since Donna Haraway, you know about Donna Haraway, not only perhaps in the context of what we are currently talking about, that is Chthulucene, that is generally about let's say forging tentacular bonds with other animals. You probably also have heard of Donna Haraway from the perspective of cyborgs, because much earlier, so Donna Haraway of late, in the last 15 years or so, Donna Haraway has been talking predominantly about animals, about forming tentacular bonds with animals, becoming kins with animals, species meeting. But Donna Haraway, in her earlier avatar, 40 years back, Donna Haraway of the 1980s, the Donna Haraway that, let's say, I, as an old man, as a relatively older man, would have grown up with in my student days, that Donna Haraway used to talk about. So exactly. So Priyanka and others know it, the Cyborg Manifesto. So Donna Haraway in the 80s was known for another issue altogether, which is that of the cyborg. Whereas currently Donna Haraway may have moved more, but the point is still the same. That is, human beings cannot survive in isolation. Human beings have to be conceived of as having bondages, as having some kind of assemblages with other beings. In the Cyborg Manifesto, that is Donna Haraway of the 80s, Donna Haraway of the 90s, she was talking about these machinic assemblages, with mechanical parts, with non-living, inanimate beings. And we are not really digressing into the Cyborg Manifesto, because probably most of you know cyborg feminism well enough, that how at a future, just like this is also a future horizon, this is a speculative future event horizon. That is, when Thulu-like, octopus-like, tentacularly, we'll all form connections with each other, and Thulu-wise, we'll be able to, through species meeting, we'll be able to heal this world. So, just like that is speculative, in her earlier avatar also, Donna Haraway was indeed speculative, that in an event horizon of the future, where human beings and inanimate objects will become indiscernible. They will kind of become fused into each other. The cyborg, the possibility of the cybernetic organism, and where age-old binarisms, because ultimately her object is to do away with gender injustice in that particular article in the Cyborg Manifesto. But she says that this whole man-woman dichotomy itself will be undone when we have undone even more formidable and more profound and deeper dichotomies, like like human, animal, or animate beings and inanimate beings, when such binaries themselves get broken in the hybrid formations, like the cyborg itself being a hybrid formation, then obviously such binaries, such hierarchic constructions, they themselves also stand dissolved. But we are not particularly interested in cyborg feminism here, because that is really not our topic of discussion. But what is important is that these connections that Haraway seemed to be talking about, because here Haraway was talking about tentacular connections with other species, other living species, living beings, whether plants or animals, whereas in her earlier work she was talking about similar tentacular or otherwise cabled connections, wired. If the wire is anyway better than the tentacle, or the wire is another metaphor for the tentacle, but wired connections with the inanimate world, with the cybernetic world. We are all cabled, some cable put here, some we all with the little ear pods in our ear, etc. So you get the idea. So the assemblages is still there, with whether through tentacles or through wires. But the point is, and therefore this would be in a way the next keyword. So, and already someone has through the idea of post-human, one has already or talked about transhumanism rather, but almost hinted at the idea of the post-human. So in a way the tentacular connections probably lead us to some kind of a post-human future, where human beings are not the only ones alone. I mean, one has to continuously think of this bonds, these tentacular or otherwise bindings with inanimate objects, with technology, with other animals, with plants, with geological objects perhaps also, because it's with the geological object where we almost return to the earth that I would in a way end my discussion in maybe just another 10 more minutes or so, so that it can also leave us some space for discussion, for some questions and answers. Not much, but maybe just about 10-15 minutes for discussion perhaps. But anyway, so we were talking about these assemblages, these kind of bonds that we form, in a way becoming post-human as it were. But these bonds, these very tie-ups, whether with inanimate objects, with technology, with machines, or with other animals, they're all part of the same scheme. That is what I wanted to say through Donna Haraway. Now, does that necessarily lead us, because in a way Donna Haraway's entire premise, both in her Cyborg Manifesto and in her latest avatar, in talking about forging kinship bonds with animals, species meeting, tentacular thinking, all of it seems to be a bit optimistic. That is, indeed, through these bonds, we will be able to somehow overcome the problems that we have. But is it really that, is that promise really something that holds? And wherein one can move on to our next keyword, or next set of keywords perhaps, which I will type at one go, one after the other. Already posthumanism has been pointed out. So that is very much there, and transhumanism, etc. But the other after the particular keywords that I have in mind, one is singularity. Now, this is a very important term, and the next is biopolitics. So, which is something that one must talk about immediately hereafter. So, this whole connection. So far we were talking about how a means to remedy and ecosophically deeply think about the environment, environmental hazards, probably ends up with the Donna Harawayan prescription of a speculative future, of us forming these tentacular bondings with other species, with technology, with machines, etc., etc. So far, so good. But does this, and this is what I was pointing out, does this necessarily become as optimistic as we think it is? This us being logged in, us being continuously plugged in to technology, or us being logged in with other animals, etc. Now, this term singularity, or technological singularity more like it, this was a term I'm typing as I'm talking. This was a term that was coined by someone called Ray Kurzweil, and also someone called Werner Vinge gives. I'll just type down both their names. Because maybe technological singularity is not something that you are very familiar with, but Werner Vinge. So these are two American thinkers who separately talked about the idea of singularity. Singularity is that event horizon. So we were talking about these speculative event horizons. the time to come. Yes, Rama Banerjee or someone raised one's hand, but you can just now hold on to your hand for just a few more minutes, because I'll be over in any case, and then one can chat as much as you want to. Not as much, but as much as time would permit. But anyway, the idea of singularity is also an event horizon. And the speculation is that soon we are moving towards that kind of a threshold, that kind of a horizon, where the living and non-living distinction, the human technology distinction, will itself dissolve. We'll all become one. That event horizon is called technological singularity, where no more will it be able to differentiate between what is a sentient living being and what is already with movements in AI and robotics, we are moving towards that. And in fact, Werner Vinge and Ray Kurzweil separately would go on to suggest that maybe by 2050s or so, we would have reached singularity, when no more will it be able to, we will be able to discern between what is technological and what is human, or what is living, so to say. Now, while one need not necessarily be dystopically charged about this event horizon, where we all become plugged into machines, but dystopian thoughts do emerge, and primarily biopolitics becomes the very domain through which, and many people have talked about biopolitics, and we really do not have the time currently to go into detail about it. But Foucault, for instance, Foucault, the late Foucault especially, in books like Society Must Be Defended or The Birth of Biopolitics, that's a whole book by Foucault, a collection of lectures actually, The Birth of Biopolitics. Society Must Be Defended is also a connection. These are late books by Foucault. Posthumous Foucault. By the way, the word posthumous is soon something that I would enter into and end our discussion with. Almost from posthumanism to the idea of posthumous or post-death. But anyway, so biopolitics is something that you're aware of, that somehow our bodies themselves become registers of surveillance, of control, and how this possible plugging into technology, this, or tentacularly forming bonds with other species or with inanimate objects or with the world in general, is this something that we must necessarily welcome? Or must we also be wary of? Because the technological singularity that we are being driven towards, the post-humanistic futures that we are being driven towards, that need not be all rosy, in spite of one of the key authors being Rosie Bradotti. But anyway, that aside, suddenly I thought of making this wisecrack. But it's not all that rosy, because as Agamben also, for that matter, had warned us, Agamben has also written in Homo Sacer, for instance, the whole theory revolves around biopolitics in a way. So the biopolitical regimes, where in a way this possible forming kin with other animals, forming kin with other machines, forming these Harawaian kind of assemblages in a cyborgic manner or in a Thulu manner, this may actually lead us to further dystopic possibilities of control, dystopic possibilities of segregation. And what could have been more, let's say, evident to our immediate lived reality than the pandemic? And the pandemic, when the pandemic struck, it was almost as if exactly what we have been talking about so far, what we've been generally reading about, all of it suddenly really got true. So the whole idea of forging bonds with other animals, or human beings coming unnaturally close to other animals, that need not necessarily lead to such rosy, embracing, kinshipy futures. Because all the epidemics in the past, be it AIDS, which apparently caused because humans had unnatural connections with monkeys, or be it swine flu, mad cow disease, bird flu, and you name it, MERS, the Middle East, which apparently came from camels, all the SARS, even the current pandemic, which apparently came from bats. So let's say human-animal connections, these relationships, if the epidemics almost emerge more often than not precisely when such transgressive connections, which are probably thulucenic in nature, which are probably tentacular in nature, but it is connections between humans and animals that lead us into these situations like the pandemic, and which actually usher in further biopolitical control. Because in the classical Foucauldian paradigm, let's say you had to be in a cell to be panoptically surveilled, right? You have to be put in prison. You have to be put in carceral apparatuses like, let's say, mental asylums or the clinic or the prison. But now our own rooms, our own houses became prison cells. We were confined. The pandemic kind of confined us within our own space under severe biopolitical control, being vaccinated, being kept tab on through apps, whatever, Arogya Setu and all that, continuously under surveillance. So the pandemic kind of suddenly showed us that what is the absolute palpable reality of this very interspecies connections leading to the biopolitical, and in a way singularity, almost in a post-humanistic way, almost infringing upon our human lives, and whether that is really something that one looks forward to or not. And the pandemic, incidentally, also made major thinkers right. So as soon as the coronavirus, as soon as the pandemic started, the writing started flowing almost immediately, as if of course, Agamben drew a lot of flack, as you'd know. Agamben has written a whole book also, as you'd know, on the pandemic, so which is called the Where Are We Now? The Epidemic as Politics. This is by Agamben. This is a full book, as indeed Zizek has. I'll just paste a few readings here, just like one is doing. So this is a book by Agamben, Where Are We Now? The Epidemic as Politics, which Agamben wrote in 2020. Then Zizek wrote two books and several articles also. So COVID-19 Shakes the World, that is Pandemic 1, and Pandemic, and then there is Pandemic 2 also. There are two books by Zizek, which Zizek also came up immediately with two books straight away, and Pandemic and Pandemic 2. And apart from that, Zizek wrote a few articles also. So again, the pandemic also invoked mixed reactions, because someone like Agamben was deeply disturbed and distraught, and Agamben thought that the pandemic has really brought in biopolitics to our doorstep, and he almost Karen-like, Trump-like, he almost rejected, no, I won't get vaccinated, I will never wear a mask, this is this covering of my face, this is some kind of a deep, what should we say, a deep conspiracy by the state to finally biopolitically bind all us up. Whereas Zizek was cautiously optimistic. In fact, Zizek goes on to say, peculiarly perhaps, but this would lead me to my last and final point, but Zizek went on to say, just like the Black Death, the plague, which happened, as you'd know, in the 14th, 15th century in Europe, just like the Black Death, it caused havoc, but it almost kind of ended the medieval era and brought in modernity. So similarly, these pandemics almost often are reset buttons, as it were. The pandemics almost often bring an older era to an end and usher in a new era. So Zizek was almost optimistic that look how the pandemic has altered things. Even deeply conservative states like the United States, they are also now thinking of investing in public health. Look how couples who had been estranged, now that they are locked up within one room, how they have now started rediscovering love, etc. So Zizek writes at length about how the pandemic can also be seen as not positive, but how the pandemic can be also seen as some kind of a switch. So where one can look forward. So death being a means towards revival, death being a means towards rejuvenation, so to say. And this would lead me, therefore, to the idea of death, to this whole idea of from biopolitics to a certain kind of thanatopolitics. Something like Achille Mbembe, etc., would have talked deeply about thanatopolitics, but to the idea of something that I've already mentioned, of the idea of the posthumous and the idea of humus also. So, as Donna Haraway says, and Donna Haraway again is this playful master of words, she goes on to say that at the end of the day, she says that post-human, she says, I don't believe in this word post-humanism and all that. If at all there is anything, then we are posthumous. We are humus. At the end, humus means fertilizers. At the end of the day, we are all composed. As Donna Haraway would go on to say, we are all composed. And she would in fact say that composting is hot. Ultimately, we will all die. and we will all kind of become ashes to ashes, dust to dust. We'll all become part of this very world, of this very geological sphere that we, so the ultimate end of, let's say, the Thulucenic bonds is when and where there is this continuous play on human, humus, posthumous. So okay, we are dying. So let's say there is a possibility of despair in much of eco-criticism, almost now in a circular manner. Let me get back to what I was talking about right at the beginning and bring my discussion to a close so that we can have that 10 minutes of discussion that we thought we ought to have. So we were talking about despair. Eco-criticism entails a certain oppositional sense of despair, that things are really going bad. Oh, no, we must plug this hole. But once we think, as Cheryl Gottfried had already told us, once we think that we have to move on from the critical phase to the more philosophical phase, ecosophical phase, and once that leads us through deep ecology, through an understanding of anthropocene, I'm not just stringing together all the keywords, through an understanding of Capitalocene and Plantationocene into the idea of the Thulucene, that is of kinship, of making bonds, making tentacular connections with other species. And once that, in a roundabout way, leads us through the idea of singularity unto the dystopic possibilities of biopolitics, and we come face to face with the pandemic situation that currently we have just kind of emerged out of, we realize that death is the ultimate leveler. Death is what looms large over all of us, and wherein we, so if at all we are post anything, we are actually posthumous. We already always are dead beings, these little puny lives of ours. Ultimately, we will all just be submerged in the earth. We'll become dead. We'll become part of compost, but as compost, as humus, as indeed dead debris do. So must we despair that we are all dying, or must we rejoice at the fact that ultimately, as humus, as debris, as compost, as organic matter which will fertilize new life forms, as it were. So in a way, maybe we won't live. We have indeed pushed the earth towards the precipice of such disaster that the human species will certainly vanish. There is no doubt about that. But ecosophical wisdom tells us that even when we die, our remains, the posthumous remains, the humus that we human beings will become, the compost, and composting is hot, as Donna Haraway would say. We should all kind of go into composting. And this is a whole thinking process also, thinking of one's own decay, thinking of one's own decline as being positive, thinking of one's own death as being something that is productive, and whereby I, through my death, my inevitable being reduced to nothing but humus, I, this human who thought of myself as being the center of everything, I, in my posthumous stage, as humus, will probably fertilize new life forms to come. Through my death will emerge newer life. And that is the kind of future through the tentacular modes of thinking that we can possibly look forward to. But anyway, it's been a long day. So if we, a long day, and the day wasn't long, but it has been a longish lecture. So we have around 10 minutes or so for discussion. I'd be very happy to field any questions, but ultimately do keep this whole scheme in mind, where from one keyword to the other, almost to repeat from eco-criticism to ecosophy, to deep ecology, to, let's say, anthropocene, to moving into Thulucene, to moving into animal studies, to moving into singularity, to posthumanism, to biopolitics, and then coming back to the idea of compost and posthumous. This whole thing together would comprise a good module of understanding what eco-criticism should be all about. So I think many people have raised their hands. So Priyanka, Meena, and Pratik Patnaik, you may please ask you. And there are other, okay, these are the only two hands. Yes, please.
Thank you for this wonderful.
And Sanskriti, you can put up your question. Over to you.
Okay. Thank you so much, sir,
Okay,
for
right.
this.
There is a question in the text box, chat box too. Yes.
So thank you so much for this wonderful lecture on everything you've talked about, and you ended it with such a hopeful note on while talking about death and everything. So my question is related to this as well. That while we talk about post-humanism and this tentacular thinking and this relation between technology, environment, and human and politics and everything that you talked about, which I don't need to elaborate on, but I want to talk about could artificial intelligence, as we did not go on to that, but it was you were pointing to that. Could artificial intelligence take up the place of those translators or those people who want to go to the grassroots, or shall I say, rural India, and work on those translations that cannot be done by technology as of now? But would you say that the artificial intelligence brings sense of despair among these translators? I'm being myself one, if you
Well,
remember.
it probably does, and it's quite beyond the scope of today's discussion. But nevertheless, evidently, I mean, artificial intelligence, this complete, I mean, in a way, it is entailed the kind of tentacular bondings that ecosophy drives us towards, also drives us, as my discussion showed, towards singularity. And singularity is inevitable. It's not a question of you having a choice, right? We are really going to kind of get assimilated by machines. Biopolitics is real. All of this is real. It's not a question. We can at best kind of stall it for some time. But anyway, evidently, I mean, if AI takes over the field of translation, then human translators, I mean, and who knows, AI may end up, currently it's at a very rudimentary stage, and so what ChatGPT produces is probably silly. But with further development, it's absolutely likely that soon technology may actually completely displace human beings. The question, however, is that what is inevitable? What do you do about it? Do you just kind of in a cocooned manner withdraw and agamben, like as if were, just say, nahi, nahi, mere ko nahi pasand, mere ko nahi karna hai? That doesn't help you. Conversely, would you rather embrace this inevitable demise of yours? Why must we live on? Why must the human translator live? Why must we not embrace the inevitability of our species actually dying, being driven extinct? There have been so many extinctions, mass extinctions down history. How are we exceptional? We are just a blimp on this whole long, say, billions of years of Earth time. Of course, we'll disappear. Why be so? Why not welcome disappearance? Why not welcome death? Why not be open to the idea of one's own demise and think how, in my demise, however, there may be some hope for some future, some otherwise than how we have been. We deserve death, in short. But that is to connect your question to our today's discussion. I wouldn't want translators to die, but that's yes. Further questions. Right. So at least there's one hand raised, Pratik Patnaik, and there is one question in the chat box. So Sanskruti Pujari is from the Anthropocene. Have you already started advancing the symbols? Evidently, so that is the idea. So Anthropocene is too self-centered a notion. The idea is to move on. Now, whether we have moved or we ought to move, I mean, let's say we ought to move to the Symbiocene, we ought to move to the Thulucene, we ought to move to where symbiotically we learn to share the planet. We ought to do that. Probably we have already started doing that through general ecological awareness being built everywhere. But is it possible? Well, I mean, that is the point. I mean, probably it will never be really possible because human beings, knowing how human beings are, as my last response also was, we are such selfish beings. Will we ever really symbiotically give up our share of the earth's resources? Probably not. And the post-human future is, but again, it's not a question of viability, it's a question of inevitability. So the post-human future is inevitable. Technological singularity is what we are being driven towards. We are certainly being driven towards mass extinction. So we might as well as embrace our inevitable post-human future and inevitable posthumous future, post-death future. We are not here to stay for very long. But let's bide our time and try to do the best of it. But whether programmatically we can arrive there, well, we'll try. And that is what environmental wisdom tries to push us towards. And that too, not only in a shallow manner, but in a deep ecological manner, in an ecosophical manner. But to what extent we'll be able to, and with what end? Is it to stop stall death, to stall extinction, or is it to make the planet a better place? Because if it is only to stall our extinction, then it is as selfish as we ever were, and it's as anthropocentric and as anthropomorphic as it ever were, and probably it's not worth it then. But if it is through some kind of a symbiotic sharing of the planet's resources, including me giving up my body qua compost so that some other plant may live, etc., I mean, that speculative future is something that we can probably work towards, not programmatically perhaps, but wishfully, certainly. Yes, and then there was, of course, this other hand raised, which is...
Pratik, do you have any question to ask? Pratik
Yes,
Patnaik,
ma'am.
over to you.
Yeah,
Yes,
and
ma'am.
Vaidegi has also raised a hand. Yes, please.
Hello, sir. Am I audible?
Yes, very much.
Um, Hello, sir. This is Pratik. I am a student of Central University of Odisha. I'm in my first year. Earlier, I was reacting to your Phoebe's, scene where she says, "She look, he's your lobster." Sorry for the inconvenience there, but my question is, where do you connect the concept of anthropocentrism with eco-philosophy or eco-criticism in general? I mean, is it the animal studies and the kinship that you talked about?
Yeah, no, I am not too sure if I've got your question, but say if your question was a kind of an ironic one, that is, can we really? I mean, ultimately, ecosophy is also a human philosophy. It is we human beings who are talking here today, who are chatting today. I mean, Deleuze and Guattari and everyone that we mentioned today, Donna Haraway included, are all human beings. So, however much holier than thou we may think of ecosophy, that finally human beings are thinking through tentacles about other species, about symbiosis, about making kin, etc. But ultimately, it is still anthropocentric because the discourse is emerging from human beings. If that is the crux of your question, I totally admit this irony.
Yes.
But whether the irony is therefore to be altogether discarded, that is, I'm not very sure about, because irony itself is a very powerful tool. So what if it's ironic? I mean, so what if it is the human being who is ironically starting questioning the human being's own centrism? What is the problem with that? So let the discourse of ecosophy be anthropocentric itself too, following your argument, because it emerges from human beings, but its desire is not anthropocentric. So a thought that emerges anthropocentrically and yet tries to ironically dismantle its own centrism, it's probably a thought worth living for or worth dying for, following the general tenor of my argument. So indeed it is ironic that ecosophy and ye badi badi baatein, but these are also anthropocentric at the end of the day, evidently. But maybe it is better than that kind of selfish anthropocentrism, which only talks about anthropocentrism. Here, at least, there is a centered anthropos who's trying to decenter his own centrism through a philosophical overture. And let's kind of admit this irony, right? So there is
Yes.
there was another
Thank
hand
you.
raised by someone called Vaidegi. Yes, please.
Sir, good evening, sir. I'm Vaidehi, a research scholar from Tamil Nadu. Firstly, I'd like to thank you for this elaborate and lucid lecture of yours. I have two questions. I want to know if there are any seminal eco-critical texts focused specifically on the dilapidation caused to the land, just like other elements of the biosphere being focused on in various eco-critic texts, and also how would you view eco-criticism as a theory from the perspective of Indian eco-critiques, and if there are any seminal works of Indian eco-critiques that you would suggest we should read? That is also. Thank you.
Well, maybe offhand I would be able to do neither. So basically, your questions are bibliographical, but maybe I can get back to you. I can search right now, but then your methodology and my methodology would be the same. So offhand, so you basically want two sets of bibliographical elements. One about such theorists who would have talked about geological issues more than biological issues, because the bulk of the people that I talked about today do talk about biological issues rather than geological issues. And the second is, if I can also give you some kind of a reading list about key Indian eco-critics who would have thought about more Indian issues.
Exactly.
I
Yes,
admit
yes.
I cannot offhand rattle a bibliography here, but definitely, I mean, if you get in touch with me, I can get back to you. And otherwise, you can also do this basic search, but offhand, I cannot, and I'm sorry about it. Anyway, this search would go on. There is another question. two questions in the chat box. So one by Preeti Dash. Anthropomorphism and anthropocene are absolutely distinct concepts. And anthropomorphism means when something which is not a human being becomes like a human being, right? So when an animal becomes humanized or something. Whereas anthropocene is a geological age. So the two have no connection whatsoever. But could, let's say, a certain degree of anthropomorphism be brought in notions of the Anthropocene and vice versa? Perhaps. I mean, it's possible that as we talk about how human beings have degraded the earth geologically, causing deep, let's say, geological impact, maybe we can also bring in anthropomorphic elements in it, but the two are otherwise quite unrelated. Mehul Rawat, the same technology that is causing distress is also okay. So there was another question by Rajendra Rana before that. So do we need development or destruction so far as eco-criticism or ecosophy is concerned? Uh, if I get your question right, do we need to develop ecosophy, or do we need to, should, in our philosophical overture, should development or building up on this thought be our objective, or destroying, deconstructing be our objective? I think it's more of the latter, because ecosophy, if ultimately ecosophy in my discussion points more towards its own demise, ultimately pointing towards the human being himself becoming just humus, becoming just posthumous, becoming just death, then, and as earlier someone also pointed out, that this is probably deeply ironic. So maybe ecosophy and ecocriticism are not oriented towards development of thought. If at all one is to do more ecosophy, that will come through not a development of the trajectory of that thought, but rather through a development, insofar as the development is aimed towards a destruction, aimed towards its own demise, aimed towards its own deconstruction. So the way, I get your point fully, so the way a particular discipline evolves over time, so it can either develop or it can cause its own supersession. Maybe ecocriticism and ecosophy, more like it, is more aimed towards the latter, because if it in an accretional manner goes on developing, then even the body of ecosophy itself becomes counter to its own posthumous purpose. So maybe it's a deconstructive philosophy, where again, being anthropocentric, it however talks about deconstructing that very anthropocentrism. So that's a wonderful question. Then there was this longish, which when I was scrolling to, I saw this previous question. So the same technology that is causing this, Mehul Rawat, causing distress to the ecology, may be used to restore ecological systems. We can do this restoration actively, possibly. I mean, certainly. I mean, that would be partly Donna Haraway's point also, because Donna Haraway is not a technophobe at all. On the contrary, she's quite technophoric. And as I said, her earlier work, which is all about embracing technology, is also in a way inextricably connected to. So technology itself can also be used, and agree. I mean, let's say solar punk as a whole, a science fictional subgenre, would talk precisely about sustainable technological means, using sustainable energy and moving more to renewable energy sources. So cutting technology to the bare minimum, that is possible, but to what extent that is practicable is quite a difficult question to resolve. So you're right, Mehul. So probably one has to move towards more sustainable deployments of technology, rather than this mythical possibility of doing away with technology altogether. And in any case, whatever we do, we are being driven towards our own death. So it doesn't really matter at the end of the day. But nevertheless, that would be probably better, more ecosophically sound. Surya asks, to solve the ecological concerns and problems surrounding humans and non-humans can be stressed off. Is there a universal language to view and understand, rather than only viewing from human understanding? Well, I mean, ultimately, again, the point that was raised much earlier by Pratik, that the irony of it all is that we can only possibly think, unless technology has somehow allowed us to hear what cats think, etc. Maybe our point of departure will always be human thought. That is ironic, but that is pretty much it. So we may not really get to know what the non-human side is thinking, but the evidence is there. We can see how oil slick is causing decimation of marine life. We can see how so many species are going extinct right in front of our eyes. So what they think, you've rightly pointed out, it's in a way ironical that we'll never get get to know what the non-humans think, but we get to, in a human way, perceive what the non-human species are undergoing. And maybe that does therefore inform us in an ironic anthropocentric way towards build-up of our ecosophical senses. And Priyanka thinks that, yes, so dead translators are, we can all have a dead translator society like Dead Poet Society. Dechen Wangbo asks, how can we employ a deep ecology perspective to analyze folk songs? Well, specifically, I wouldn't know, but the idea is that the environmental wisdom that the particular community has. So let's say if folk songs are merely critical, which they never are, then they are probably subject to eco-critical readings. But more often than not, communities from whom the folk songs emerge, they will have deep environmental wisdom, which has traditionally been passed down generations, which they bear within them. And their folk songs will bear this deep environmental sensibility, this deep environmental wisdom, this deep ecological sensibility, rather than only a surface, shallow sense of let's not cut that tree or let's not dam that river. So I think folk songs can be a repository, a rich repository of a deep environmental wisdom, and indeed you can therefore delve deep into it, and that is absolutely possible. Rajendra Rana asks again as to how far ecocritical study is successful to check environmental issues. It is not very successful, honestly, because shallow ecocriticism can do nothing. Because how does it matter if you do an eco-critical reading of John Donne or Shashi Deshpande? How does it matter? So eco-criticism will do nothing, right? But ecosophically, once you realize that the surface thing will not solve any problems, maybe one will be able to tackle environmental issues only with a deep sensibility. So eco-criticism, and that was the point with which I began, and that is the point with which I'm ending also. So eco-criticism will never really resolve any environmental issues. One has to have a deep environmental sensibility for that. Ananya Anindita asks, so literature responds to all these kinds of changes in society. Yeah, so literature responds in all possible ways, and dystopia is, of course, one way of reacting to this. But not all literature that reacts to biopolitics, not all literature that reacts to singularity, not all literature that reacts to ecosophical issues are necessarily dystopic, but evident. And furthermore, it's not, as I ended my lecture on what may seem a backhanded hopeful note, even what may appear dystopic is probably not hopeless at all. Maybe death is our future. So when one talks about demise, one talks about what may appear dystopic, one is probably talking very optimistically, because it's only in that reset, as Zizek also did in a way in his pandemic books. Maybe it's in that reset that our ultimate hope lies. But you're absolutely right that contemporary literature is continuously responding to the very issues that were raised here, tentacularly, interspeciesly, through medical humanities, through health humanities, through talks on biopolitics, through science fiction, through all kinds of speculative fiction, and dystopia being one of the modes of dealing with that, certainly. What literature is continuously trying to perform a counter-hegemonic role, and so I don't understand why being in pop culture would be a problem, because popular is the domain. I mean, ultimately, popularity alone will probably be, we are talking only popularly here. We are not. I mean, the distinction between high culture and pop culture is neither sustainable nor desirable. In fact, it just smacks of a certain elitism, a certain hierarchy that we must break through. It's the symptom of that very elitism which would cause this anthropic, non-anthropic divide and ecological disasters. So pop is our horizon. It is through pop that, if at all, any redemption would, if at all, would emerge. Gopinath asked about eco-justice. Well, I mean, ecological justice, that's pretty self-explanatory, and one may not have the time to go into it. And Rajendra Rana says that everybody's business is nobody's business. biopolitics can be checked. I mean, I wouldn't know how it can be checked. Again, biopolitics is real, but we have to probably, in a way, through more subversive alternate bonds, maybe forming, if let's say the social media networks as governed by the industrial, let's say, conglomerates are indeed biopolitically trying to algorithmically control our universes, we may form our little clandestine subcultural groups, perhaps, and wherein one is again using that very technology, that very principle, and that very Thulu like principle of, or cyborg like principle of forming bonds, but maybe in a subcultural, subversive way to precisely almost fly under the radar of the big brother watching grand narrative of biopolitics. So, can biopolitics be resisted by, let's say, what in altogether in a very, very different context, Philippe Lacoue-Labarthe would have called desistance, by desisting from technology, by withdrawing from technology. Agamben also talks about withdrawing from technology. But can we withdraw from technology and escape biopolitics? No, because biopolitics is so overarching, it will get us. So maybe the only way we can resist biopolitics is by creating subversive, almost subcultural micro networks, using the very technologies of biopolitics, but to create alternate networks, perhaps alternate thulic tentacular bonds, perhaps, rather than the mega tentacular bonds. Priyanka Meena talks about a trend on social media in which humans are comparing their bodies to Earth's geological features and putting these videos. Yes, I mean, but some of these may be fads, some of these may be in earnest. But yes, I mean, ultimately, these trends, they could be seen in a way in a continuation of this ecosophical understanding of us being, I mean, kind of thinking ourselves as planetary, thinking ourselves as thulic, thinking ourselves as tonic, possibly. Mehul, I don't write, unfortunately, much, so you have to just hear me, perhaps. And Kajori asks, right, Ecocriticism and Ruskin Bond's writings. I'm not sure. I'm not very sure. I'm not sure at all, because I don't know if Ruskin Bond is eco-critical. And the writers that I discussed with, they are like theoreticians. And I'm not very sure about your question, unfortunately, Kajori. But let's say, if Ruskin Bond has been eco-critical in some of his works, maybe he's ecosophical too, because why unnecessarily blame Ruskin Bond, such an important author like Ruskin Bond, as being shallow? Maybe he is deep enough, but I wouldn't know really.
So we
Sentiment,
will entertain
yes,
another 2-3 maximum questions, because
right,
you have
because,
already given much of your precious time. So
yes,
my dear
right.
participants who are online, I have a request. I understand you are so much engrossed in the session. Same like me, we have so many questions, but trust me, we are running short of time. Sir has already given 2 hours of his time to us. So we will have 3 more questions, and that's it.
Yes,
Thank you.
and there are two more in the chat box already, as I can see. So maybe
Yes,
those
yes,
two can
they're right
be.
now typing their questions right in front of me, sir. So we can have 2-3 more questions.
Acha, okay, okay.
That's it.
So,
Over to you, sir.
so Sentilemla asks, this is about accepting mass human extinction or death and the philosophy of giving back to nature. I agree to that idea. It is true that when one goes back to earth, to death, gives back. However, I feel it is acceptable only it is if it is through natural causes. Yeah, but we don't have a choice. The only thing is that, I mean, we are getting extinct, certainly. There's no doubt about that. Now, whether we despair over it, we'll try our best to stall it, but the inevitable will happen. Or must we, rather than despairing, also think of the possibility of ashes to ashes, dust to dust, us dying and in a way fertilizing the earth? So it's a future, speculative future horizon. So through natural death, yes, I mean, that would be ideal, but we are going to die through mass extinction too. I fully understand that you're not very happy at that prospect, but maybe we can all die very soon. I mean, the way we are going, and let's try hard to stall it. But anyway, I fully agree with you, and I'm on the same page with you. But maybe we will not have much of a choice as to whether, it's not that there's a menu of death. Would you like to die naturally? Would you like to die in a car crash? Would you like to die through environment? Maybe we wouldn't have a choice. Or would you like to die in an epidemic? I mean, it will come. But anyway, Conference CO2 asks, how is tentacular thinking that you talked about different from the... Well, it's absolutely different, because linear thinking is linear. It connects from one point to the other in a rectilinear way, thinking only in straight lines, whereas tentacular thinking rhizomatically crisscrosses. It pauses, it stutters, it stammers, it kind of stops somewhere, it curls over, it bends over. It's an altogether different model of thought. So linear thinking, if a creator is a linear creator, then probably that particular creative genius is only restricted to creating straightforward, logical, objective thought. Whereas most creativity is probably, in a way, already pretty tentacular, pretty convoluted, and pretty rhizomatic, and pretty free flowing in nature. And that is, I'm not saying that linear creation is bad. Who am I to make value judgments? But maybe most creativity is much more convoluted, much more thinking out of the box than linearity would allow us. So tentacular thinking is indeed of that sort. Right. And Priyanka, okay, the dead, sure. Right, yes. And so thank you very much for your patience and for your time. And it was great interacting with all of you. Thank you very much.
Sir,
Okay, sorry, there's
one more question, sir, if you don't mind. She's standing over there for the past 45 minutes, and she wanted to raise this question to you, sir, if you don't mind.
Right. So species kinship, human beings have a superiority complex. Yes, that was one of the the earliest questions that were raised, that isn't there an ironic anthropocentrism in all this? True. And even in the classic animal studies texts, ultimately, be it Agamben's Open or be it Derrida's The Animal, Therefore I Am, ultimately there is as if some anthropic agency where I still, as a human being, I almost deign to give in to some kind of an animal kinship, and never are we equally responsive to what the animal thinks, though Derrida's book in a way drives us towards that. But you're right. So there is always a skewed, loaded side to this kinship. It, in a way, but that is the irony therein. But let us, because what is the other choice that we have? Because we are human beings at the end of the day, and until such time when AI completely displaces us, and we are probably allowed through technology perhaps to actually know what the animals are thinking, what the plant is thinking, we are unfortunately we are restricted to only our thought, and that's all that we have. The question is, how do we deploy that thought? Do we deploy it ironically towards our own undercutting, or do we deploy that towards further aggrandizing our anthropocentrism? That is what will be of consequence. But you're absolutely right, and thank you very much for that question. Thank you.
So thank you so very much. But before I come to the formal ending part of the session, I have a request. I think I have to ask your permission to have another session of yours. I have to welcome you once again, because my students sitting here in my classroom, they think that I didn't give them the opportunity to ask their questions to us, and we were entertaining the questions of these participants online. So once more, my dear participants and my students sitting in this class, we have another session of Sir some other time maybe. And coming to the formal part of the session, sir, on behalf of the Department of English Language and Literature, Central University of Odisha, on behalf of our Honorable Vice Chancellor, Professor Chakravarti Tripathi, the entire university, which is actually a family, Central University of Odisha, from the bottom of my heart, I thank you so very much. And I really appreciate the way you have been handling the questions. That maybe I can say it is over the years, the experience that you have gained. And initially we thought we can have the question answer session just for 10 minutes, but I was watching, we continued for 40 minutes and you didn't miss a single question. So hats off and salute to you, sir, for so much of patience. And the questions were crossing each other, like from every field there was a question, and from the questions were various variety of questions were there, and you answered them so perfectly. It was in fact a very, very informative session. To be honest, sir, when I was in my college days, I was in my university, and even after that, we used to think eco-criticism means whatever was just on the surface. We even never tried to go deep into it. As you gave the example rightly, like a ginger, the rhizomes. So we read whatever was there visible, available to us right on the table. That's it. We never ever even thought of going deep into it. So it's not like rhizome. It's just like the tap root of a tree that goes deeper and deeper and deeper. So with you, even I realized that there is something more to eco-criticism. The session was really outstanding, I can tell you, sir, and hoping to have some more interactive sessions of yours in the future. And I promise all the participants and all our students that we will keep calling, sir, and I hope he doesn't mind giving us time for more sessions. It's an earnest request from our side, sir. Thank you so very much, and thanks to your simplicity and humbleness, the way you presented, I can anytime say that I've never come across such a simple person in my life in this particular field. Thank you so very much, sir.
Thank you so much. The pleasure was entirely mine. And now I'll take your leave, and I wish you all the very best for all your future endeavors.
Namaskar.
Yes, yes. Bye.
Thank you so much, the participants online. And I thank you all for joining us. Be with us for further such sessions. And I promise you, we will come again, once again, with more beautiful sessions. If possible, please keep sending us your choices, like the field that you would like to explore more. And I would try my best to invite resource person, which can suffice to your demands. Whatever topic you feel like having a session on, I will try my best to get the resource person from those particular fields. Thank you so very much. Namaskar.